Here it becomes evident the absurdity of a comparison of concentration camps based on the omission of the treatment reserved by the liberal West for the inferior races, and also in the separation between internal policy and foreign policy, between repressive practices and the ideologies with which they are established. If we take into consideration these elements and these often ignored connections, the usual association of the two totalitarian dictatorships turns into an antithesis. It was observed that Stalin was very impressed by the awakening of oppressed or marginalized nationalities within the Habsburg Empire. In reference to that, we turn to his observations made in 1921, at the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party. 550 years ago all of Hungary's cities had a German character. Now they've been Magyarized. The Czechs also experienced an awakening. It's a phenomenon that affects Europe as a whole. From the German city that it once was, Riga becomes a Latvian city. Similarly, the cities of Ukraine are inevitably Ukrainized, the Russian element once predominant becoming secondary. 518 As they become aware of that process, considering it progressive and irreversible, the Bolshevik Party as a whole, and especially Stalin, commit themselves to a new and fascinating experiment in governing a multi-ethnic state, which can be described as follows. Quote, the Soviet Union was the first global empire founded on affirmative action. The new revolutionary government of Russia was the first among the old multi-ethnic European states to face the growing wave of nationalism and to respond to it by systematically promoting the national consciousness of its ethnic minorities and establishing for them many institutional forms typical for a nation-states. The Bolshevik strategy was to assume leadership of the decolonization process that appeared inevitable, and they carry it out as a way to preserve the territorial integrity of the old Russian Empire. To that end the Soviet state created not only a dozen republics of ample dimension, but also tens of thousands of national territories spread out over the length of the Soviet Union. New national elites were educated and promoted to leadership positions in the government, schools, and in the industrial companies of these recently created territories. In many cases this made necessary the creation of written languages where previously it hadn't existed. The Soviet state financed the mass production of non-Russian language books, newspapers, magazines, movies, operas, museums, orchestras of popular music and other cultural products. Nothing similar had ever been attempted. 519 inches. Unquote. The novelty that this policy represents stands out even more if we compare it with the obsession for uniformity that in the middle of the 20th century dominates the United States and Canada. Forced to break ties with their birth community and with their very own family, native children must also renounce their dances and their strange clothing. They are forced to have short hair and, above all else, avoid the use of their tribal language as if it were the plague. Breaking the rule that demands exclusive use of English carries severe punishment, and in Canada they are even subjected to electric shock. 520 With regard to the USSR, there's an essential point on which today there's a type of consensus. Quote, the republics received, some before others, a flag, an anthem, a language, a national academy, and in some cases even a commissar for foreign relations, and they retained the right, later utilized in 1991, to separate from the Federation, although there hadn't been a specified procedure. 521 inches. Unquote. In Mein Kampf, Hitler is also fixated on the Slavicization and the erasing of the German element underway in Eastern Europe. In his eyes, however, it is neither a progressive nor irreversible process, but only the most radical measures can halt it and roll it back. It's not a matter of pushing forth a policy of assimilation and promoting a Germanization of the Slavic element in Austria. No, one can carry out the Germanization of the land, but never the men. It would be absurd to want to make a black or a Chinese person into a German, just because he learned German, or is prepared to speak German in the future and vote for a German political party. Such Germanization would, In truth, be a degermanization, it would mean the beginning of a bastardization and, therefore, of the annihilation of the German element, or the annihilation of the very characteristics, in their time, that made it possible for the conquering people to achieve their victory. 522 To Germanize the soil without Germanizing the men is possible only following a very precise model. On the other side of the Atlantic, the white race expanded to the west, Americanizing the soil, certainly not the Native Americans. This approach allowed the United States to remain an Ordo-Germanic state without degenerating into an international melting pot of peoples. 523 That same model should be followed by Germany and Eastern Europe. While the Bolsheviks are concerned with promoting in the Soviet republics the most diverse national elites and local political classes possible, Hitler's announced program for the conquest of the East is the exact opposite. All representatives of the Polish intelligentsia must be annihilated, all means need to be used to prevent a new intellectual class from forming. Only in this way can the colonial objectives be completed. The peoples destined to work as slaves in service to the master race should not forget that there can only be one master, the German. 524 In his usual speech at the 10th Congress of the Russian Communist Party in 1921, Stalin calls attention to another element of change that is being witnessed in world history. During the imperialist war, the belligerent imperialist powers had been forced to turn to the colonies, from which they had extracted the manpower for their armies, and this could only advance the cause of freedom and the struggle by these people and these populations. The national awakening in Eastern Europe is joined by the one taking place in the colonial world. In general, the advance of the national question in the colonies is no coincidence, from the point of view of history. 525 While in Europe the national awakening is called upon to put an end to the policies of discrimination, denationalization, and the oppression of national minorities, in the colonies it's destined to radically put into question the concentrationary universe built by the conquerors for those races considered inferior. The novelty of resorting to troops of color did not go unnoticed by Hitler, who doesn't hesitate in denouncing this betrayal of the white race. France is especially guilty of this, where a process of bastardization and negroization is quickly and ruinously put into practice, and where one even witnesses the rise of an African state on European soil. 526 Before us here are not prejudices, before us is a precise political program, which look on in horror at the use of colored troops and also at racial intermixing in the sphere of sexual relations and marriage, because these practices, in degrading the barrier that separates the master race from the servant race, put into crisis the dominion in the concentrationary universe that the master race must impose on the servant race in the superior interest of civilization. From the point of view of the Nazi leader, the national awakening in Eastern Europe and the use of troops of color in the West's internal conflicts constitute a terrible global threat to civilization and to the white race. The construction of a racial state and empire, and the unleashing of the war in the East, similarly represent a response to that threat, with a flow into the Nazi concentrationary universe of an immense mass of slaves drawn from the inferior races and destined to work and die of overwork in service to the master race. The Nazi concentrationary universe is set up to devour millions upon millions of slaves or superfluous human beings that inevitably arise out of a program that aims for the constant Germanization of the soil, excluding a priori the natives who inhabit it from Germanization. And that project would have yet devoured an infinite number of more victims, if it had not been defeated by an opposing project, based on the recognition not only of existential rights, but also the cultural and national rights of the natives. By a series of both objective circumstances and subjective responsibility, that in no way should be dismissed, that second project also produced a concentrationary universe, but, even with its horrors, it can't in any way be associated with the first, that explicitly presuppose the continuation of the genocidal practices already underway in the colonial world itself, and its even more brutal extension to the new colonies to be built in Eastern Europe.